The morning sun shone bright over the University of North Carolina campus in Chapel Hill. Students walked to their classes with books in hand and dreams in their hearts. Among them was a young woman who stood out from the crowd. Her name was Eve Carson, and she was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. Eve was 22 years old and had already made her mark on the world. She was not just another college student trying to get by. She was the student body president of one of the most respected universities in America. When she walked across campus, other students would wave and call out her name. Teachers smiled when they saw her coming. Even the janitors and cafeteria workers knew who she was. But Eve was not popular because she was rich or famous. She was loved because she truly cared about people. She had a way of making everyone feel important. When she talked to you, she looked right into your eyes and listened to every word you said. She remembered your name and asked about your family. This was just who Eve was. Her story began in Athens, Georgia, where she was born to parents who taught her right from wrong. Bill Carson worked hard to provide for his family. He was a man of few words but strong values. Susan Carson was warm and loving, the type of mother who always had cookies in the oven and a hug ready when you needed it. Together, they raised Eve to believe that helping others was the most important thing you could do in life. Eve learned this lesson well. Even as a little girl, she would share her toys with children who had none. She would help her neighbors carry their groceries. When she saw someone crying, she would sit with them until they felt better. Her parents were proud, but they were not surprised. This was simply the way Eve saw the world. In high school, Eve was the girl everyone wanted to be friends with. She played on the soccer team and sang in the choir. She got good grades without making other students feel bad about themselves. She tutored kids who were struggling with their homework. She organized food drives for poor families during the holidays. Her teachers often said that Eve was special, that she would do great things one day. When it came time to choose a college, Eve had many options. Schools across the country wanted her to come study with them. But she chose the University of North Carolina because she felt it was a place where she could really make a difference. She wanted to study political science because she dreamed of working in government someday. She believed she could help make laws that would help people live better lives. College life suited Eve perfectly. She joined clubs and organizations that helped the community. She volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends. She read stories to children at the local library. She visited elderly people in nursing homes who had no family to see them. Eve did all of this while keeping up with her difficult classes and maintaining excellent grades. Her professors noticed her right away. Dr. Robert Johnson, who taught her introduction to government class, later said that Eve was the kind of student who made teaching worthwhile. She asked thoughtful questions and really cared about learning. She did not just want to pass tests and get a degree. She wanted to understand how the world worked so she could help fix its problems. By her junior year, Eve had decided to run for student body president. Her friends encouraged her because they knew she would be perfect for the job. The campaign was not easy. She had to give speeches and debate other candidates. She had to make promises about what she would do if elected. But Eve approached it the same way she approached everything else in her life. She was honest, she worked hard, and she truly wanted to help her fellow students. When the votes were counted, Eve had won by a large margin. Students across campus celebrated. They knew they had chosen someone who would fight for them and represent them well. Eve was excited but also nervous. Being student body president was a big responsibility. She would have to work with university officials, organize events, and solve problems that affected thousands of students. Eve threw herself into the job with her usual energy and dedication. She started programs to help students who were struggling with money. She worked to improve campus safety. She organized volunteer opportunities for students who wanted to help their community. She met with university leaders to discuss important issues. She even found time to continue her own volunteer work. During this time, Eve was also in a relationship with a fellow student named Michael Thompson. Michael was studying engineering and shared Eve's love of helping others. They had been dating for over a year, and everyone who saw them together could tell they were truly in love. Michael admired Eve's dedication to making the world better. He supported her dreams and goals. They often talked about their future together and how they could work as a team to help people. Eve's parents visited campus often and were always amazed by how many people knew and loved their daughter. They would walk across campus with Eve and watch as student after student stopped to talk with her. The conversations were never short. Students would tell Eve about their problems, their dreams, their fears, and Eve would listen to every word and offer help when she could. As her senior year began, Eve was already making plans for after graduation. She wanted to go to graduate school to study more about government and politics. She had been accepted to several excellent programs. Her professors wrote glowing letters of recommendation. Her future looked bright and full of possibilities. Eve had no way of knowing that her time was running short. She had no idea that evil was already moving toward her quiet college town. She went about her daily routine of classes, meetings, and helping others. She studied late into the night, preparing for exams and working on projects. She made plans with Michael for the weekend. She called her parents to tell them about her day. March 5, 2008, started like any other day for Eve Carson. She woke up in her off-campus house on Friendly Lane, a quiet street where many students lived. She had breakfast, gathered her books, and headed to campus for another day of classes and student government work. She had no way of knowing it would be her last. While Eve Carson was living her life full of hope and dreams, two other young men in Chapel Hill were walking a very different path. Their names were Lawrence Levet Jr. and Demario Atwater. Unlike Eve, they had chosen a life of crime and violence. They did not care about helping others or making the world better. They only cared about themselves and getting money the easy way. Lawrence was 17 years old but had already been in trouble with the police many times. He had been arrested for stealing, fighting, and other crimes. He came from a broken home where no one taught him right from wrong. He dropped out of school early and spent his days on the streets with other criminals. He had no job and no plans for the future. He just lived day by day, taking what he wanted from others. Demario was 21 and even more dangerous than Lawrence. He had a long criminal record that included robbery, assault, and drug crimes. He had been in and out of jail since he was a teenager. He was angry at the world and blamed everyone else for his problems. He never took responsibility for the bad choices he made. He believed that society owed him something, and he was going to take it. The two men had become friends because they both lived the same criminal lifestyle. They would spend their time planning robberies and looking for easy targets. They especially liked to target college students because they thought students were weak and would not fight back. They had robbed several people before, but had never been caught for those crimes. On the evening of March 5, 2008, Lawrence and Demario were driving around Chapel Hill in a stolen car. They were looking for someone to rob so they could get money, for drugs and other things they wanted. They had no jobs and no legal way to get money, so they simply took it from innocent people. They did not care who they hurt as long as they got what they wanted. The two men knew that the area around the university was full of students who had money and cars. They had robbed students before in other parts of town. They knew that many students lived in houses near campus and often came home late at night from studying or social events. These students made perfect targets because they were alone and not expecting trouble. As they drove through the quiet residential streets, they talked about their plans. They wanted to find someone who looked like they had money. They wanted someone who had a nice car they could steal. They wanted someone who would be easy to control and would not cause them problems. They had no idea that they were about to encounter someone whose death would make national news. Around midnight, they were driving slowly through the neighborhoods near campus. Most of the houses were dark and quiet. Students were either asleep or studying in their rooms. The streets were empty except for an occasional car passing by. It was the perfect time for criminals to do their work without being seen. Lawrence and Demario had been drinking alcohol and using drugs earlier that evening. This made them even more dangerous and unpredictable. When people use drugs and alcohol, they often make decisions they would not make when sober. They become more violent and less concerned about consequences. They stop thinking about how their actions will affect other people. At around 2 in the morning on March 5th, the two men spotted exactly what they were looking for. They saw a young woman returning home to a house on Friendly Lane. She was alone, and appeared to be a college student. She was carrying books and looked like she had been studying late. She was walking toward a nice blue Toyota Highlander parked in front of her house. The woman was Eve Carson, though the two criminals did not know who she was. They did not know that she was student body president or that she spent her life helping others. They did not know that she was loved by thousands of people on campus. They did not know that her parents had raised her to be kind and generous. All they saw was a target. Lawrence and DeMario quickly made their decision. They would rob this young woman and steal her car. They thought it would be easy because she was small and alone. They thought she would be too scared to fight back or cause trouble. They had no idea that they were about to commit a crime that would shock the entire nation. The two men got out of their stolen car and approached Eve as she was unlocking her front door. They had weapons with them, which made them feel powerful and in control. Eve was caught completely off guard. She had been thinking about her studies and her plans for the next day. She was not expecting any trouble in her safe neighborhood. When Lawrence and DeMario confronted Eve, she immediately realized she was in serious danger. These were not college students or people from her community. These were dangerous criminals who meant to harm her. Eve was scared, but she tried to stay calm and think clearly about what to do. The two men demanded that Eve give them her money and her car keys. They threatened to hurt her if she did not cooperate. Eve had no choice but to do what they said. She was outnumbered and outgunned. She had to hope that if she gave them what they wanted, they would leave her alone and go away. But Lawrence and DeMario had bigger plans. They were not satisfied with just taking Eve's money and car. They decided to force Eve to come with them so they could use her bank cards to get more money. They made Eve get into her own Toyota Highlander with them. Lawrence drove while DeMario watched Eve to make sure she did not try to escape. This was when Eve's nightmare truly began. She was now a prisoner in her own car with two violent criminals who had complete control over her. She did not know where they were taking her or what they planned to do. She could only hope and pray that somehow she would survive this terrible ordeal and see her family and friends again. The blue Toyota Highlander pulled away from Friendly Lane and disappeared into the dark streets of Chapel Hill. Inside the car, Eve Carson faced the most terrifying hours of her young life. The two men who had taken her captive had no mercy and no conscience. They saw her only as a way to get money, not as a human being with a family who loved her and a bright future ahead of her. The morning of March 5, 2008 started like any other day in Chapel Hill. People were getting ready for work and school. Students were walking to their early classes. Parents were making breakfast for their children. Nobody knew that something terrible had happened during the night. Nobody knew that one of their most beloved community members was gone forever. At around 5 in the morning, a man named Robert Williams was getting ready to leave for his job at the local hospital. Robert lived on Hillcrest Circle, a quiet street about a mile from the university campus. It was a peaceful neighborhood where families felt safe letting their children play outside. Crime was rare, and neighbors looked out for each other. As Robert walked toward his car in the early morning darkness, he saw something strange in the middle of the street. At first he thought it might be a pile of clothes or garbage that had fallen from a truck, but as he got closer, his heart began to race. What he saw was not garbage. It was a person lying motionless on the cold pavement. Robert immediately called 911 from his cell phone. His hands were shaking as he spoke to the emergency operator. He told them that he had found someone who appeared to be dead in the middle of Hillcrest Circle. Within minutes, police cars and ambulances were racing toward the quiet neighborhood with their sirens wailing. When the first police officers arrived, they quickly secured the area around the body. They could see right away that this was a crime scene. The young woman lying in the street had been shot multiple times. There was no doubt that this was murder. The officers immediately called for detectives and crime scene investigators to come to the scene. Detective Sarah Martinez was one of the first investigators to arrive. She was an experienced police officer who had worked on many serious crimes. But when she saw the victim lying in the street, she felt sick to her stomach. The young woman looked so peaceful, almost like she was sleeping. But the bullet wounds told a different story. Someone had killed this innocent person in cold blood as more investigators arrived. They began the careful work of examining the crime scene. They took photographs from every angle. They looked for bullet casings, footprints, and any other evidence that might help them catch the killer. They measured distances and made detailed notes about everything they found. While the investigators were working, word began to spread through the neighborhood that something terrible had happened. People came out of their houses and gathered on the sidewalks. They whispered to each other and tried to figure out what was going on. Many of them were scared because violent crime was so rare in their safe community. It took several hours before the investigators were able to identify the victim. When they finally learned who she was, everyone involved in the case was shocked. The young woman lying dead in the street was Eve Carson, the student body president of the University of North Carolina. She was supposed to be in class that morning. Instead, she was dead. Detective Martinez had to sit down when she heard the news. She knew who Eve Carson was. Everyone in Chapel Hill knew who she was. Eve was famous for all the good things she did for the community. She was supposed to be one of the people who made the world better, not someone who became the victim of senseless violence. The news of Eve's death spread quickly across the university campus. Students who were walking to their morning classes began getting phone calls and text messages from their friends. At first, many people did not believe it. They thought it must be a mistake or a cruel joke. Eve Carson could not be dead. She was too young, too good, too important to the community. But as the morning went on, it became clear that the terrible news was true. Eve Carson, the beloved student body president, had been murdered. Classes were canceled as word spread across campus. Students gathered in small groups, crying and comforting each other. Teachers and staff members struggled to find words to help their students understand what had happened. The university administration called an emergency meeting to decide how to handle the crisis. They knew that thousands of students, parents, and community members would be looking to them for answers. They needed to provide accurate information while also showing respect for Eve's memory and supporting everyone who was grieving. Meanwhile, investigators were working frantically to find Eve's car. They knew that the blue Toyota Highlander was missing and might contain important evidence. Police officers were searching all over Chapel Hill and the surrounding areas. They checked parking lots, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas where criminals might try to hide a stolen car. At around 10 in the morning, another 911 call came in. A woman reported that she had found a car on fire in a wooded area several miles from where Eve's body was discovered. When firefighters arrived to put out the flames, they found the burned remains of Eve's blue Toyota Highlander. Detective Martinez and her team rushed to examine the burned car. Even though the fire had destroyed much of the evidence, they were able to find some important clues. There were fingerprints on parts of the car that had not been completely burned. There were also some personal items that belonged to Eve scattered around the area. The discovery of the burned car told investigators a lot about what had happened. It was clear that whoever killed Eve had also stolen her car and then tried to destroy the evidence by setting it on fire. This suggested that the crime was planned and that the killers knew they needed to cover their tracks. As news of the burned car spread, the reality of Eve's murder began to sink in for everyone in the community. This was not a random accident or a crime of passion. Someone had deliberately targeted Eve, kidnapped her, killed her, and then tried to hide the evidence. The cruelty and planning involved in the crime made it even more shocking and heartbreaking. By noon on March 5th, news reporters from across North Carolina were arriving in Chapel Hill to cover the story. The murder of a beloved student body president was big news, and everyone wanted to know what had happened and who was responsible. Detective Sarah Martinez knew that solving Eve Carson's murder was the most important case of her career. She had been a police officer for 15 years and had worked on many difficult crimes. But this case was different. Eve was not just another victim. She was someone who had touched the lives of thousands of people in the community. Everyone was looking to the police to find her killers and bring them to justice. Martinez assembled a team of the best investigators available. She worked with FBI agents who specialized in violent crimes. She brought in crime scene experts who could analyze even the smallest pieces of evidence. She coordinated with campus security officers who knew the university area well. Everyone involved in the investigation knew that they had to work quickly and carefully to catch the killers before they struck again. The first step was to trace Eve's movements on the night she was killed. Investigators interviewed her friends, classmates, and boyfriend Michael Thompson. They learned that Eve had spent the evening studying at home and had not planned to go anywhere that night. She had talked to Michael on the phone around 11 p.m. and seemed happy and normal. Nothing suggested that she expected any trouble. The investigators then began looking at security cameras from around the Chapel Hill area. They knew that Eve's blue Toyota Highlander had been driven around town during the night, and they hoped that cameras had captured images of the car and whoever was driving it. This was slow and difficult work because they had to check cameras at banks, stores, gas stations, and other businesses all over town. Their hard work paid off when they found security footage from several ATM machines. The cameras showed Eve's Toyota Highlander arriving at different bank locations during the early morning hours of March 5th. The footage was grainy and dark, but investigators could see that there were people inside the car using Eve's bank cards to withdraw money from her accounts. The ATM footage was crucial evidence because it showed that Eve had been kidnapped and forced to give her captors access to her money. The timestamps on the cameras also helped investigators understand the timeline of events. They could see that the car had visited multiple ATM locations over several hours, which meant that Eve had been held captive for a long time before she was killed. Bank records showed that someone had used Eve's debit card to withdraw hundreds of dollars from her accounts. The transactions happened at different locations across Chapel Hill between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. This information helped investigators narrow down the areas where they should look for more evidence and witnesses. The investigation continued. Detective Martinez received a break that would change everything. 2 days after Eve's murder, Lawrence Levet Jr. and Demario Atwater were arrested on unrelated charges in a different part of town. They had been caught trying to rob another person, and police officers had arrested them at the scene. When Martinez learned about these arrests, something made her suspicious. The timing seemed too convenient. 2 young men with criminal records had been arrested for robbery just days after Eve's murder. She decided to investigate whether there might be a connection between these arrests and Eve's case. Martinez ran background checks on both Lawrence and Demario. What she found made her even more suspicious. Both men had long criminal histories that included robbery, assault, and other violent crimes. They were known to work together as partners in crime. They had no jobs and made their money by stealing from other people. They fit the profile of the type of criminals who might have targeted Eve. The detective decided to take a closer look at the evidence from Eve's murder scene. Crime scene investigators had collected fingerprints from inside Eve's burned car. They had also found DNA evidence on some of Eve's personal belongings that had been scattered around the area where the car was found. When Martinez compared this evidence to the fingerprints and DNA samples taken from Lawrence and Demario after their arrest, she got the results she had been hoping for. The fingerprints found in Eve's car matched both men. The DNA evidence also linked them to the crime scene. This was the proof she needed to charge them with Eve's murder. The breakthrough in the case came just 5 days after Eve's death. Martinez was excited but also nervous. She knew that having evidence was one thing, but proving the case in court would be another challenge entirely. She needed to build a case so strong that no jury would have any doubt about the guilt of these 2 men. As news of the arrest spread through Chapel Hill, people felt a mixture of relief and anger. They were glad that the killers had been caught so quickly, but they were also furious about what Lawrence and Demario had done to Eve. Many people could not understand how anyone could hurt such a kind and innocent person. The local newspaper, the Chapel Hill Herald, ran daily stories about the investigation. Reporter James Wilson covered every detail of the case and interviewed people throughout the community. The story was also picked up by television news stations across North Carolina and eventually by national networks. Eve's murder had captured the attention of people all over the country. Martinez continued building her case against Lawrence and Demario. She interviewed witnesses who had seen suspicious activity in the area on the night of the murder. She worked with forensic experts to analyze every piece of evidence. She coordinated with prosecutors to make sure they had everything they needed to win the case in court. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the ATM footage. Even though the images were not perfectly clear, experts were able to enhance them and identify features of the people in the car. The footage showed that two people had been in Eve's car when it visited the ATM machines. The timing and locations of these visits matched perfectly with the evidence found at the murder scene. Investigators also discovered that Lawrence and DeMario had been seen in the area around Eve's house on the night she was killed. Witnesses remembered seeing two young men acting suspiciously in the neighborhood. Some people had even called the police to report the suspicious activity, but by the time officers arrived, the men were gone. As the evidence mounted against Lawrence and DeMario, Detective Martinez began to put together a complete picture of what had happened to Eve. The two men had been driving around looking for someone to rob. They had spotted Eve returning home late at night and decided she would be an easy target. They had kidnapped her, forced her to withdraw money from ATM machines, and then killed her before abandoning and burning her car. The cruelty and callousness of the crime shocked everyone involved in the investigation. Eve had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. She had been targeted simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and because two criminals had decided that her life was worth less than the money in her bank account. Martinez knew that bringing Lawrence and DeMario to justice would not bring Eve back, but it was the only way to honor her memory and protect other innocent people from these dangerous criminals. 2 years after Eve Carson's murder, the wheels of justice finally began to turn. The courthouse in Chapel Hill had never seen so much attention from the media and the public. People from all over North Carolina and beyond wanted to see Lawrence, Lovett Jr. and DeMario Atwater face trial for their terrible crime. The case had become a symbol of the fight between good and evil, between innocent victims and heartless criminals. District Attorney Rebecca Davis was chosen to lead the prosecution. She was known as one of the toughest prosecutors in the state and had won convictions in many difficult murder cases. Davis understood that this case was about more than just two criminals. It was about getting justice for Eve Carson and sending a message that society would not tolerate such senseless violence against innocent people. Davis worked closely with Detective Sarah Martinez to prepare for the trial. They reviewed every piece of evidence dozens of times. They interviewed witnesses again to make sure their testimony would be clear and convincing. They studied the fingerprints, DNA evidence, and security camera footage until they knew every detail by heart. The prosecution team faced several challenges as they prepared their case. Lawrence Lovett Jr. had been only 17 years old at the time of the murder, which meant his lawyers would argue that he should be treated as a minor. DeMario Atwater's defense team was claiming that he had not actually killed Eve, even though he was involved in the kidnapping and robbery. Both defendants were trying to avoid the death penalty by shifting blame to each other. As the trial date approached, Eve's parents, Bill and Susan Carson, prepared themselves for the most difficult experience of their lives. They would have to sit in a courtroom and listen to detailed descriptions of their daughter's final hours. They would have to look at the men who had killed their beloved child. But they were determined to be there for Eve and to make sure that justice was served. The first trial was for DeMario Atwater since he was older, and his case was considered more straightforward. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February 2010. The courthouse was packed with reporters, community members, and Eve's friends and family. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice for Eve and supporting the death penalty for her killers. Prosecutor Michael Roberts opened the trial with a powerful statement to the jury. He told them about Eve's life and all the good things she had done for others. He described her as a young woman who had dedicated herself to helping people and making the world better. Then he told them about the night she was murdered and how two heartless criminals had destroyed her bright future for a few $100s in cash. Roberts presented the evidence piece by piece. He showed the jury photographs of the crime scene, where Eve's body was found. He played the security camera footage from the ATM machines that showed her car being used by her killers. He brought in forensic experts who explained how the fingerprints and DNA evidence proved that DeMario had been in Eve's car on the night she was killed. The prosecution's case was strong and convincing. Witness after witness testified about seeing suspicious activity in Eve's neighborhood on the night of the murder. Bank employees explained how someone had used Eve's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts. Police officers described finding her burned car and the evidence that linked it to the defendants. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Michael Thompson, Eve's boyfriend, testified about their last conversation. He told the jury that Eve had seemed happy and excited about her future when they talked on the phone that night. She had been making plans for the next day and looking forward to graduating from college. Michael broke down in tears as he described how much Eve meant to him and how her death had destroyed his own dreams of a future with her. DeMario's defense lawyers tried their best to create doubt about his guilt. They argued that Lawrence Levet Jr. had been the one who actually killed Eve, and that DeMario had just been along for the ride. They claimed that DeMario had been drinking and using drugs that night and did not fully understand what was happening. They asked the jury to show mercy and give him life in prison instead of the death penalty. But Prosecutor Roberts was ready for these arguments. He reminded the jury that it did not matter who pulled the trigger. Both men had participated in kidnapping Eve, robbing her, and ultimately causing her death. Under the law, they were both equally responsible for her murder. He argued that anyone who could do such terrible things to an innocent person deserved the ultimate punishment. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. Every day, the courtroom was full of people who wanted to see justice done for Eve. Her parents attended every session, holding hands and supporting each other through the painful testimony. They never missed a day, even when the details of Eve's suffering became almost too difficult to bear. When the jury went out to deliberate, everyone in Chapel Hill held their breath. The community had been following the trial closely, and everyone wanted to see DeMario convicted. People gathered in bars, restaurants, and coffee shops to wait for the verdict. Students at the university organized prayer vigils and memorial services for Eve. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached their decision. They found DeMario Atwater guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. When the verdict was announced, Eve's parents broke down in tears of relief. Finally, one of their daughter's killers had been held accountable for his crimes. But the trial was not over yet. The same jury now had to decide whether DeMario should get life in prison or the death penalty. This phase of the trial lasted another week as both sides presented arguments about what punishment would be appropriate. The prosecution argued that the death penalty was justified because of the especially cruel nature of Eve's murder. They pointed out that she had been held captive for hours and forced to endure terror and suffering before she was finally killed. They argued that someone who could commit such a heartless crime deserved to die for it. The defense asked the jury to spare DeMario's life. They brought in family members who talked about his difficult childhood and the poverty he had grown up in. They argued that executing him would not bring Eve back and that life in prison without parole would be punishment enough. In the end, the jury decided to sentence DeMario Atwater to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While some people in the community were disappointed that he did not get the death penalty, most were satisfied that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars and never have the chance to hurt anyone else. The trial of Lawrence Levet Jr. would come next, and it would present even more challenges for the prosecution. Because he had been a minor at the time of the crime, his case was more complicated. But District Attorney Davis was determined to see that he too faced justice for his role in Eve Carson's murder. As the first trial ended, Eve's parents spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. They thanked the prosecutors, police officers, and jury members who had worked so hard to get justice for their daughter. They said that while nothing could bring Eve back, they were grateful that one of her killers would never be free to hurt another family the way they had been hurt. The trial of Lawrence Levet Jr. began 6 months after DeMario Atwater was convicted. Even though Lawrence had been only 17 at the time of Eve's murder, the prosecutors had successfully argued that he should be tried as an adult because of the serious nature of his crimes. The evidence against him was just as strong as it had been against DeMario, and the prosecution was confident they could get another conviction. Lawrence's trial followed a similar pattern to the first one. The same evidence was presented, and many of the same witnesses testified. The security camera footage still showed Eve's car at the ATM machines. The fingerprints and DNA still linked Lawrence to the crime scene. The forensic evidence still told the same tragic story of what had happened to Eve during her final hours. Lawrence's defense lawyers tried a different strategy than DeMario's team had used. They focused heavily on his age and claimed that he had been influenced by the older DeMario to participate in the crime. They brought in experts who talked about how teenage brains are not fully developed and how young people can be easily led into bad decisions by older criminals. But prosecutor Davis was not swayed by these arguments. She reminded the jury that Lawrence had chosen to participate in kidnapping, robbing, and murdering an innocent young woman. She argued that some crimes are so terrible that age does not matter. She pointed out that Eve Carson had been only 5 years older than Lawrence, but she had chosen to spend her life helping others instead of hurting them. The jury in Lawrence's trial deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. Like the first jury, they found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. They also sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With both killers now convicted and sentenced, the legal phase of Eve Carson's case was finally over. But the impact of Eve's murder and the fight for justice was far from finished. Her death had changed the Chapel Hill community in ways that would last for generations. People realized that even in their safe college town, terrible crimes could happen to the best and most innocent people. They understood that they needed to work together to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Bill and Susan Carson, Eve's parents, decided that the best way to honor their daughter's memory was to continue the work she had been doing when she was alive. They established the Eve Carson Memorial Fund, which provided scholarships for students who wanted to dedicate their lives to public service. The fund helped young people pay for college so they could follow in Eve's footsteps and work to make the world better. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill also created several memorials to honor Eve. They established the Eve Carson Scholarship, which was given each year to the student who best embodied Eve's spirit of leadership and service to others. They built a beautiful garden on campus where students could go to remember Eve and reflect on the importance of treating others with kindness and respect. The student government at the university created the Eve Carson Award for Student Leadership. This award was given to students who worked hard to help their fellow students and improve campus life. Winners of the award received money to continue their education and were encouraged to pursue careers in public service, just as Eve had planned to do. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had led the investigation into Eve's murder, often spoke at police training sessions about the case. She used Eve's story to teach other officers about the importance of thorough investigation and never giving up on victims. She said that working on Eve's case had reminded her why she became a police officer in the first place, to protect innocent people and bring dangerous criminals to justice. The case also led to improvements in campus safety at universities across the country. Many schools increased lighting in areas where students lived and walked at night. They improved their emergency alert systems and taught students how to stay safe when they were alone. They hired more security officers to patrol campus areas during late-night hours. James Wilson, the reporter who had covered Eve's case for the local newspaper, wrote a book about her life and death. The book became a bestseller and helped spread Eve's story to people all over the world. Wilson donated much of the money from the book to the Eve Carson Memorial Fund so that more students could benefit from scholarships in her name. Michael Thompson, Eve's boyfriend, struggled for years to cope with losing the woman he loved. He eventually became a teacher and told his students about Eve's life and the importance of treating others with kindness. He said that remembering Eve's example helped him find meaning in his own life after such a terrible loss. 5 years after Eve's murder, the university held a special memorial service to remember her life and celebrate her lasting impact on the community. Thousands of people attended, including students who had never known Eve but had been inspired by her story. The speakers talked about how Eve's legacy lived on through all the good work being done by people who had been touched by her example. The memorial service featured a choir singing Eve's favorite songs and speakers reading from essays she had written about her dreams for the future. Her parents spoke about how proud they were of all the young people who were carrying on Eve's work of helping others. They said that while they would always miss their daughter, they found comfort in knowing that her death had inspired so many people to live better lives. Even Lawrence Levet Jr. and DeMario Atwater sitting in their prison cells could not escape the impact of what they had done. Other prisoners who learned about their crime treated them as outcasts. They faced constant danger from inmates who believed that people who hurt innocent victims deserved to be punished even in prison. They would spend the rest of their lives knowing that they had destroyed not only Eve's future, but their own as well. Today, more than 15 years after Eve Carson's death, her name is still spoken with respect and love in Chapel Hill. New students at the university learn about her story during orientation programs. They are taught that being part of the university community means looking out for each other and working together to create a safer, more caring environment for everyone. The house where Eve lived on Friendly Lane has become an unofficial memorial. Students often leave flowers and notes there to remember her. The current residents of the house say they feel honored to live in a place where such a special person once made her home. They try to follow Eve's example by being good neighbors and helping other students whenever they can. Eve's story reminds us that even when terrible things happen to good people, their legacy can live on through the actions of those who remember them. Every student who receives a scholarship in Eve's name, every person who chooses kindness over cruelty, and every act of service done in her memory helps to ensure that her death was not meaningless. While Lawrence Levet Jr. and Demario Atwater took Eve's life, they could not destroy the impact she had on the world. Her spirit of generosity, leadership, and love continues to inspire people to be better than they might have been otherwise. In that way, Eve Carson achieved a kind of immortality that her killers can never touch or destroy.